Knowledge.
The Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. It's spelled, if you're transliterating it, Gnosis. The Gnostics were people that believed that all of life was about knowledge, what you know. You've ever heard of the term agnostic? An agnostic is one who says, I don't know. An atheist is a person that says you can't believe in God. An agnostic is a person that says we can't know. In the Greek language, what they would do is they had what was called the alpha primitive. Put the A on the front of a word and it negates that word. So if Gnostic, if gnosis means I can know, agnostic means I cannot know. These are people that thought that knowledge was all important. That knowledge was supreme. And they believed that they had supreme knowledge. And what they believed was that there was no way that human flesh, because human flesh is sinful, that it could not be righteous and it could not in any way touch divinity. Therefore, Jesus could not come and live in human flesh because divinity and sin could not intermingle in any way. Well, John answered this in his first writings back in John chapter 1 when he said in verse 14, what did he say?
The Word became flesh.
The Word became flesh. That's a direct hit at what these people were teaching. They said there's no way that heaven could come down and become flesh. There's no way that God could do that. Well, you read John 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Verse 14, the Word became flesh. And so you have the proofs that Jesus is the Son of God. The second thing I wrote down here is there's preaching or teaching of the proof. And so look at verse 2. John says, or verse 3, we bear witness and declare unto you. So there is the preaching of the proof. The third thing is there is the personal reception of the teaching. Verse 3, that which we have seen and heard we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. Another key idea in the book of 1 John, other than eternal life, is the idea of fellowship. The word fellowship comes from the Greek word koinonia. It literally means communion or close association. John says, we've declared these things to you so that we can have close association with one another. And when we have fellowship with one another, our fellowship is also with the Father and with His Son. The fellowship that we enjoy as Christians is three-dimensional. We have fellowship with God, and we have as individuals, and we have fellowship with one another. So it becomes a three-dimensional type of fellowship. There is God, there is an individual, and there are other Christians. But that fellowship is only what it should be when all Christians are united in God. And so he would say later on in verse 7, if we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. Now you come down to, and then the fourth thing I thought about here was the promise of fellowship with God. And so you have the proofs about Jesus, the preaching of those proofs, the personal reception of that preaching, and the promise of fellowship with God. And then John comes to the main part of the letter, the main body, begins in chapter 1, verse 5. And as you look at verses 5 through 10, there are some important lessons that we need to draw. There are some errors that are taught from time to time that we need to be aware of. We need to remember that John would say here that we cannot walk in darkness. If you're a Christian, you cannot walk in darkness. Again, it is the present tense. You cannot habitually live in a state of sin. You cannot keep on walking in darkness. Number two, we cannot declare or we cannot claim that sin has no real significance in our lives. Now, it's one thing to say, I'm not going to live in a state of sin, but I need to be careful that I don't go to the other extreme and say that sin doesn't matter, that sin isn't significant in my life. I believe Paul thought that sin was significant in his life. Turn, for instance, to Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. In Romans chapter 7, Paul writes what appears to be, if you're reading in the English language, some confusing statements. It's difficult to even comprehend as you're listening to what he's saying. But in the context of Romans 7, what Paul is saying here is that I know that there are things in my life that I'm doing that I don't want to do. Paul says, here I am a Christian, I'm a child of God, I'm trying to live for God, but there are things in my life that I'm doing that I know I should not do. Not only I know that I shouldn't do, but I don't want to do. Is there anybody here that can identify with that? Well, about every one of us ought to raise our hand on that one. But he also says, there are things in my life that I know I need to be doing, but I find it difficult to do those things. And that's the struggle that we have. And Paul classifies this struggle as the flesh versus the spirit, because the flesh is sinful. And in this context, you'll find, in some Bibles, you'll find the translation sinful nature. You also find that in like Romans chapter 6. I think there's some problems when the translations translate the word flesh as sinful nature. The idea of sinful nature seems to indicate that we are always sinners. Some people use the term sinful nature, and they think that means that we're born in sin. But the idea that Paul uses here is the Greek word sarke. I believe it's sarke, and it means flesh. And Paul is saying that there's a part of us that is sinful. And that part of me sometimes does things that I know I don't want to do. That's the spiritual part. The spiritual part, the flesh doesn't do the things that I sometimes want to do. And so we cannot claim that sin has no real significance in our lives. Be careful that when you say that we don't sin or we don't live a lifestyle of sin, that you don't go to the opposite extreme and say sin doesn't matter. That sin doesn't affect me anyway. Well, guess what? It does affect all of us. And then the third thing here is, in these verses 5 through 10 of 1 John 1, we cannot assert that we have not sinned. Read 1 John 1 verse 10, someone.
If we claim we have not sinned, we make him out to be a liar, and his word has no place in our lives.
Okay, if we claim that we have not sinned, then we make him out to be a liar. Who is he talking about when he says we make him? Who is the him there? All right? If you say you haven't sinned, you've turned God into a liar. Because God says you do sin. Now, you don't live a lifestyle of sin, hopefully. You don't keep on sinning habitually. And so, the point of all of this is to say, in 1 John 3, 6 through 9, what John is talking about is a lifestyle of sin. And if you are a Christian, you will not live a lifestyle of sin. You will not habitually sin. You'll not keep on sinning over and over and over again. It won't become a pattern in your life if you're a Christian. Now, I want to close at least my part by saying, if you are a Christian and you are living a lifestyle of sin, then you need to do something to correct that.